Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes it feels like my marriage with Nick is a beautiful yet empty display case. We are that couple everyone admires. People say, "You have it all. Perfect home, perfect careers." I nod, smile, but inside, there's an emptiness. Our conversations have become endless discussions about grocery lists or weekend plans. It feels like I don't know him anymore, and he doesn't know me. We're living by some kind of schedule that lost its meaning a long time ago. Nick has always been ambitious, and that once attracted me. He built his career, and I was proud of him. But over the years, I realized that his life became all about work and our marriage. Just another item on his to-do list. We talk about bills, taxes, meetings with his partners. It's all part of our world, but there's nothing about us anymore. There hasn't been any emotion in our conversations for a long time. "How was your day?" he asks, without looking up from his phone. His finger endlessly scrolls through numbers or emails. "Not bad," I reply, though the day was utterly unremarkable. I don't share my thoughts with him anymore. Once, it came so naturally, but now it feels pointless. I take a glass of wine, mindlessly twirling it in my hands. A wave of guilt washes over me, though I can't even explain to myself what exactly I feel guilty for. Is it because Nick got lost in his work? Or because I've become a bystander in my own life? And then, one night, at a family dinner, Ethan appeared. Nick's stepbrother, a mysterious figure everyone talked about, but few really knew. I'd only seen him a couple of times when Nick and I first got together. He was always an enigma, spontaneous, free from obligations, like nothing could tie him down in this world. But that evening, when he walked into the house, I felt the air in the room change. "Emily, it's been a while." He smiled, coming closer. His voice was deep, enveloping. I'd almost forgotten what he was like. The prodigal son had returned. "Yes, Ethan, that's true. How have you managed to stay off the radar for so long?" I tried to keep the conversation light, though strange feelings began to stir inside me. He smirked, and something mysterious flashed in his eyes. "Life can be unpredictable. Sometimes you just have to disappear to find yourself," he replied, and it sounded almost like an excuse. I smiled, but there was a hidden truth in his words that struck me more than I expected. I glanced at Nick. He wasn't paying attention to us, absorbed in something on his phone again. I had a strange feeling that I wasn't the one who should be searching for herself, but that thought was too frightening to pursue. "And you?" Ethan suddenly asked, leaning in slightly. "How are you, Emily?" "How's life?" I froze for a moment, searching for the right words. "How am I?" I didn't know. "Life goes on," I finally answered, trying to sound confident. "I have my studio, work. Everything is like everyone else's." "Everything like everyone else's," he repeated, and there was something genuine, almost insistent in his voice. "That doesn't sound much like you." I felt a slight anxiety rising. His words seemed to touch a string I had long tried not to pluck. Don't I know myself that life has become monotonous? Why did he, after just a few minutes, immediately see that? "Sometimes things change, Ethan," I said, trying to shift the topic. "People grow up, priorities shift." He nodded, but his gaze was persistent, almost probing. "People grow up, yes, but not everyone loses themselves in the process." His words felt like a challenge. Inside me, confusion grew. Why had this man, whom I barely knew, suddenly become so close? And why did his words resonate within me more than anything Nick had said in recent months? I couldn't find answers to these questions. The dinner continued, but my attention was fully on Ethan. Every gesture, every glance evoked strange feelings. It seemed that for the first time in a long time, I was feeling someone's real presence, someone who wasn't absorbed in himself. Nick was somewhere nearby, but it was as if he was in another world. His usual focus on work became even sharper in that moment, when, in Ethan's presence, I felt alive. Real. When we were saying our goodbyes after dinner, Ethan touched my hand. It was just a momentary contact, but it left a mark. A light touch that made me realize this evening was not just another family dinner for me. It was nice to see you again, Emily, he said quietly, leaning in slightly. His breath brushed my cheek for a moment, and I felt something tighten inside me. I hope we'll see each other again. I nodded but couldn't respond. At that moment, I realized that, again, wasn't just inevitable. I was waiting for it. I didn't often walk through the industrial district. Those abandoned factories, rusty pipes, and buildings with shattered windows seemed like symbols of a time that had passed, leaving its marks on the walls and in the heart of the city. But that day, I decided to do a photo shoot for my studio's new project, and this part of town was perfect for my ideas. Time felt as if it had stopped here, like no one was in a rush, and no one was trying to change anything. I walked along the deserted street, watching the long shadows stretch from the buildings, when suddenly someone approached me from the side. For a moment, I froze, not expecting to see anyone here. It was Ethan. He appeared so abruptly, as if he'd materialized from an old movie, a character waiting to be noticed. Emily? His voice was just as calm as I remembered, but now it sounded closer, almost blending with the wind that swept through the empty streets. I turned around, unable to hide my surprise. Why here? Why now? Ethan, I exclaimed, slightly confused. What are you doing here? I'm working on a project to renovate this part of the city, he replied, nodding toward an old building. These places, though they look abandoned, have potential. We're planning to turn them into residential areas, breathe new life into them. I smiled faintly, looking at the buildings that seemed long forgotten. I always thought these places were frozen in time, like old memories that no one wants to bring to light. Ethan smirked as he moved closer. Sometimes old memories are more valuable than what we'd rather forget. We stood on the street among the shadows, and at that moment, everything felt strangely right. We talked as if we'd known each other all our lives, even though in reality, we were almost strangers. How did it happen that Ethan became the person with whom I felt so free? And how have you been? He asked, breaking the brief silence. Since we last saw each other. How's your studio? I sighed, brushing my hair out of my face as the wind scattered it around. The studio? Yeah, it's going fine. I'm working. But sometimes it feels like it's all just an attempt to fill a void. You know, like you're doing something for the sake of doing it, but it never brings real satisfaction. His gaze pierced through me, as if he saw more than I was ready to reveal. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just listened. I had never been able to speak like this with Nick. Everything with him was practical, like discussing the next budget. But here, with Ethan, I suddenly felt I could talk about my fears. Have you ever felt like everything you do becomes routine? I asked unexpectedly, before I could stop myself. Like, at the end of the day, you look at yourself in the mirror and don't understand why you're doing it all? Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes darkened for a moment, as if he looked deep inside himself. Of course, he said quietly. I had to leave everything behind and come back here. I lost more than I ever thought I could. Sometimes, going back is like looking at a shattered painting you've been trying to piece together. His words, like a revelation, touched something deep inside me. I hadn't expected such honesty from him. The streets around us were empty, only the wind rattling old posters. At that moment, I realized that with Ethan, I could be what I couldn't be with Nick. Genuine, open. It was like coming up for air after being submerged underwater for too long. And Nick? He asked suddenly, and I felt myself tense up inside. He's always been so driven. How are things between you two? I looked away, trying not to let my emotions show. We're fine, it's just complicated. He nodded, not pressing for more, as if he knew there was no need to. It was one of those moments when words lose meaning, and only what you feel remains. Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck, I blurted out unexpectedly. Time goes on, but I'm standing in the same place. Everything seems fine, but it's like I've forgotten what real happiness feels like. Ethan looked at me intently, his eyes seeming to search the depths of my soul. Maybe you just haven't found what will make you feel alive again. Those words stuck with me like a splinter. He was right. Everything in my life had become static, like the old buildings around us. At that moment, I couldn't even admit it to myself, but something inside me had begun to change. We wandered the streets for a while, talking about the city, memories, and life. It was a strange but necessary encounter, as if someone had turned a key and opened a door I'd kept locked for so long. When we said goodbye, Ethan looked at me a little longer than necessary. Emily, he said softly, touching my shoulder. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. I nodded, feeling how his touch left an invisible mark on me. We went our separate ways, but with each step, I felt how that meeting had affected me more than I could have anticipated. The evening at the studio dragged on. I had never complained about solitude while working. On the contrary, it gave me a chance to escape reality, to lose myself in the creative process. But that evening, I felt a strange unease, as if something was lingering in the air, preventing me from concentrating. I was closing the studio when it was already dark outside. The cold autumn air stung my skin, and my quiet steps echoed along the empty pavement in the silence. I put on my coat, ready to head home, when suddenly I heard a familiar voice behind me. Emily! It was Ethan. I didn't even flinch. His appearance no longer seemed unexpected. He always seemed to find a moment when I was on the edge, as if he were a part of the turmoil inside me. I turned around and saw him standing against the backdrop of the evening city, slightly illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights. It seemed like he had simply materialized here, just like last time. Hi, I replied, trying to conceal a slight nervousness. You stayed late, too? He shrugged, smiling slightly. I thought no one would be here, but now it seems like meeting you in these places is becoming a tradition. His words sounded too casual, but I felt tension in the air. The words lost their weight, leaving only silence. I bit my lip, glancing around, though I knew the city was empty. Mind if I join you? He offered. There's a cafe nearby, a good spot for those who aren't rushing home. I nodded, though everything inside me contradicted this decision. Yet deep down, I wanted to talk, to feel that lightness he always brought with him again. Together, we walked along the empty streets, and the evening felt strangely intimate, like the whole city belonged only to us. Our footsteps echoed softly, and the silence between us was filled with something more than just words. Have you ever thought about how strangely people's paths cross? Ethan suddenly asked, breaking the silence. His voice was deep, but almost a whisper, as if he was afraid of disturbing the atmosphere. In what way? I asked, trying to grasp what he meant. We meet people, and it seems like chance, he continued. But what if these encounters aren't just coincidences? What if there's a meaning in every meeting that we just haven't realized yet? His words echoed in my mind. I remained silent, not knowing how to respond. That was exactly what I had felt from our very first meeting. Something inside me kept making me wonder if all these crossings were not random. Why did Ethan appear now, just when I began to feel like I was losing myself? I didn't believe in fate, but this feeling was too strong to be just a coincidence. When we reached the cafe, it turned out to be closed. I laughed, trying to ease the atmosphere. Looks like we'll have to continue our walk. It seems we often find ourselves in these strange situations, he said with a smirk. Maybe it's fate. I wanted to brush off his words, but something in his voice made me pause. We continued walking down the street, which seemed deserted, as if the whole world had frozen around us. Ethan talked, and I listened, as though his voice lulled my thoughts. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time. Work, memories, things that bothered us. I couldn't allow myself such conversations with Nick. I couldn't open up the way I could with Ethan, and that scared me. When we reached a crossroads, I suddenly realized that we had stopped in front of a hotel. The streetlights softly illuminated the entrance, and the silence of the street became even more noticeable. We stood there, looking at each other, and something shifted. I felt it instantly, as if the world around us suddenly quieted, and the tension between us became tangible. Ethan was silent, but his gaze spoke more than any words. At some point, he took a step closer, and my heart started racing. I knew what was going to happen, but I couldn't move, couldn't say anything to stop it. He leaned in slowly, and his lips gently brushed against mine. When Ethan pulled away, I stepped back, as if someone had struck me. My mind was blank. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My lips still felt his touch, but I wasn't ready for these emotions. Sorry, he whispered softly, as if afraid to break the moment that had just occurred. But I couldn't respond. Instead, I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed loudly along the empty street, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was running, didn't know what I would say when I saw Nick. All I knew was that everything had changed the moment his lips touched mine. The days after that evening became a true test for me. Every morning, I woke up with a heavy heart, and every night, I went to bed trying to convince myself that nothing significant had happened. But every time my thoughts returned to that kiss, something inside me turned upside down. Guilt. That was too weak a word for what I felt. I was literally drowning in my own emotions, not knowing how to pull myself out. It was especially hard in front of Nick. I looked at him, listened to his stories about work, watched him eat breakfast, sit at his computer in the evenings, and everything that once seemed familiar now appeared unreal. Our marriage, our life, it had all suddenly lost the meaning I once thought was unshakable. And I didn't know what to do. That kiss with Ethan. What did it mean to me? Why did I allow it to happen? Was it a moment of weakness, a mistake, or something more? Something I couldn't comprehend. Every time I thought about it, a wave of anxiety surged within me, so sharp that it was impossible to ignore. Ethan, I avoided him, avoided any chance of running into him. At family gatherings, where he was always present now, I would catch his gaze but quickly turn away, trying to act as normal as possible. It seemed that no one noticed the change, but inside, everything was broken. I tried to ignore his presence, but every time our paths crossed, by accident on the street or at another dinner at Nick's parents', I felt something tighten inside me. His gaze, his way of speaking, it all brought me back to that moment I couldn't get out of my head. Emily, are you okay? Nick asked one evening at dinner, after I had once again lost track of the conversation. What? I snapped back to reality, forcing a smile. Yeah, of course. Just got lost in thought. Nick gave me a concerned look, frowning slightly. You've been kind of distant lately. Is everything all right? Yeah, I answered a little too quickly. Just a bit tired. Work and all that. Nick, as usual, accepted my answer without further questions. He was like that. He didn't push for the truth unless it concerned his business or numbers. It gave me a temporary reprieve, but inside, I was torn apart by doubts. I felt like I was living in some kind of double world, where one part of me was still with Nick, and the other was pulled into something I couldn't even explain to myself. One evening, while walking home, I noticed Ethan on the other side of the street. He was wearing a light coat, looking as relaxed as ever, walking without noticing me. Instantly, I felt a lump of emotions rise inside me. He didn't see me, but I froze in place as if my feet had grown roots. I watched him from afar, and in that moment, everything I had been trying to hide resurfaced. Why? Why is this so important? Why can't I just forget that moment? Maybe it was a sign that something was missing in my life, Or is it just an illusion? A way to escape from a reality that hasn't satisfied me for a long time? These thoughts tormented me day after day. Sometimes I thought that everything that happened was just a mistake, just one kiss, but it had changed so much in how I saw my own life. Was it a way to run from the truth? I couldn't answer. And more importantly, I couldn't figure out what I truly wanted. These thoughts haunted me. Every time I saw Ethan, even by chance, I felt that strange pull drawing me in again. It was frightening and enticing at the same time. I tried to avoid those encounters, to avoid thoughts of him, but it was like trying to fight against a tidal wave. The more you resist, the stronger it crashes over you. At one of the family dinners, I noticed Ethan looking at me. His glance was brief, but full of unspoken words. Nick was engrossed in a conversation with his father, discussing another business project, and for a moment, I allowed myself to steal a glance back. In that fleeting moment, I felt everything I had been trying to hide over the past days. It was so wrong, but inside, something screamed, "This is your truth!" I couldn't pretend any longer that that kiss was just an accident. Later, when I got home, I tried to find solace in the routine, cooking dinner, cleaning, even watching TV shows I didn't care about. But deep down, I knew it was all just an attempt to hide from reality. Inside, the feeling grew that I was standing at a crossroads and I could no longer ignore the path ahead. But what could I do? How could I figure things out when I didn't even understand what I wanted? It was another art event where I was exhibiting my works. Nick couldn't make it again. Too much work, too many meetings. His absence had become the norm, so usual that I no longer expected him to come. I didn't blame him, or at least, I tried to convince myself of that. But deep down, the emptiness growing inside me was unsettling. And as if by some prearranged script, Ethan appeared at the event. He approached me confidently, without unnecessary fuss, as if our conversation was merely a continuation of one we had long ago. He wore a dark jacket, and he looked a little different from the casual, laid-back style I was used to. His presence was palpable. It filled the space around him, even when he stood off to the side, observing the works on the walls. "Emily," he called softly as I stepped away from the group of guests to catch my breath. "How are you?" I turned around, and our eyes met. In his gaze was the same persistent interest as before, and it was dangerous. A wave of nervousness washed over me, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I'm fine, just a little tired," I replied, trying to keep a light smile on my face. But maintaining that control was becoming harder with each passing moment. Ethan nodded, but I knew he wasn't fooled. He stepped closer, and at that moment, I realized he knew. He knew what was happening inside me, knew that our brief meetings, our random conversations, the kiss, it hadn't left me unaffected. "Let's go," he said quietly, nodding toward the abandoned part of the factory where renovations were still unfinished. "It's too crowded here." I didn't ask a single question. I just followed him, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. Inside, I knew what I was doing. I understood this wasn't a coincidence or an innocent walk. This was the moment I had perhaps been waiting for. We found ourselves among the abandoned workshops, where old machines and tools were covered in dust, and the windows were shattered and boarded up. Light seeped through the cracks in the walls, casting strange shadows. We stopped in one of the corners, hidden from prying eyes. Here, among the rusty structures, the atmosphere was charged with tension, so thick it could almost be touched. I could no longer hide what I was feeling. With every minute spent near him, something inside me was building, like a quiet but unstoppable wave. Ethan said nothing, but his gaze spoke for him. In that moment, I knew I could no longer fight what I felt. I no longer wanted to hold back. "Emily," he whispered, moving closer to me, his voice hoarse and low. "We both know this isn't just a mistake." I didn't respond. There was no point in denying the obvious. Everything that had happened between us up to this moment, every glance, every conversation, Every time we found ourselves alone were steps toward what was bound to happen. He stood so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. My heart was racing, my thoughts tangled. I wasn't thinking about the future, about what would come next. All that mattered in this moment was here and now. All the feelings I had been suppressing for so long suddenly surfaced, and I could no longer control them. Ethan leaned in, his face just inches from mine. I could see every contour of his features, every line on his face. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just attraction. It was something more, something I didn't fully understand but could no longer ignore. "Are you sure?" he whispered, though there was no doubt in his voice. I nodded, and that was the last thing I remembered before everything dissolved into one moment. We didn't stop. In that instant, I gave in to my emotions, to the long suppressed feelings that could no longer be hidden. His hands were warm, confident, and I felt his presence filling me, pushing everything else aside. All that mattered was this moment. I could no longer think about Nick, about my life, about my responsibilities. Inside me was chaos, but in that chaos, I found a strange sense of peace, as if I had finally allowed myself to be the person I had always been afraid to become. We didn't speak a word, but there was no need for words. Everything was clear. This moment was inevitable, and now I couldn't turn back. Nick was never one to ask too many questions. His immersion in work always played to my advantage. I could easily justify my late returns by citing studio projects or unexpected client meetings. But something had changed in recent weeks. He had become more attentive. His usual calmness had given way to a subtle wariness that he tried to hide. Our evenings at home no longer followed the usual routine. Instead of the familiar silence over dinner, Nick was increasingly asking questions, and it unsettled me. "You're late again," he said one evening as I stepped into the house. I stood in the hallway, keys in hand, and immediately felt his gaze on me. "Is everything okay?" I froze for a moment, trying to remain calm before answering. "Yeah, just a crazy day. So much piled up at the studio. I didn't even notice how time flew by." He nodded, but his gaze was too intense. I tried not to meet his eyes, afraid he might see what I was hiding inside. The truth was, like a heavy weight I couldn't shake off. "You've been staying late a lot lately," he continued. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of suspicion in it. "It didn't used to be like this." "There's just a lot of work at the studio right now," I tried to explain again, though I knew these excuses were beginning to sound unconvincing. "I just want to get everything done." "And you've been distant lately," he went on. "Sometimes you sit and stare into space, like you're not really here. What's going on, Emily?" I felt panic rise within me. Nick was starting to notice. He sensed something was wrong, though he didn't yet know what. My thoughts immediately drifted to Ethan, to our meetings that were becoming more frequent and intense. Like an addiction I couldn't resist, each time I felt myself more consumed by it. But with each encounter, I realized the deception was becoming more obvious. "Nothing in particular," I replied with a light smile, trying to shift the tone of the conversation. "Just tired. You know how it is. Too much work, not enough time for yourself." Nick fell silent for a few seconds, and that silence became unbearable. I could feel his suspicions growing, feel the questions forming in his mind, questions he couldn't yet answer. And although I tried not to give myself away, it was becoming harder and harder. Hiding the truth was like walking along the edge of a cliff. With each step, the sense of danger grew sharper. "Emily," his voice softened, but there was persistence in it. "We haven't really talked in a while. Maybe we should pause and figure out what's going on? You've changed. I don't know what's happening with you. It's like you're always somewhere else." My heart tightened. I knew he was right. I was far away, and that distance was growing with each passing day. But what could I tell him? That I was having an affair with his stepbrother? The thought was so unbearable that I tried to push it away, not even allowing it to come close. Nick, I began, searching for the right words. Everyone has times when they need to step back a little. It doesn't mean I trailed off, unable to find a suitable explanation. Just give me some time. He looked at me with an expression that tore at my heart. I could see the doubt in his eyes, but also the hope. He wanted to believe me, but I knew that belief would soon be shattered. Inside, anxiety was growing. How long could I keep up this charade? How long could I hide the truth? Okay, he said finally, his voice restrained. But if something's wrong, tell me. I'm here. You can count on me. Those words broke a hole in the walls I had been building around myself for so long. You can count on me. But I couldn't. I couldn't tell him the truth because it would destroy everything. Our marriage, our life, everything we had built. But at the same time, I couldn't stop. My feelings for Ethan were too strong, too overwhelming. Every time Ethan and I met, it felt like another breath of air after being submerged underwater for too long. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the moments we spent together, about his touch, his words. It had become my obsession, but also my weakness. With Ethan, I felt alive, as if I could finally feel something real, something deep again. But each time after those meetings, I came home feeling the growing chasm between me and Nick. Hiding it was becoming nearly impossible. Nick had become more observant, noticing every move I made, every shift in my mood. And that scared me more than anything. I knew that if he found out the truth, it would destroy everything. But at the same time, I couldn't give up what was happening between Ethan and me. It was an addiction I couldn't escape. Every time Ethan and I exchanged glances at family gatherings, I felt a storm rise within me. I tried to conceal my emotions, but his presence broke my control. Even the simple words exchanged between us seemed filled with something more than just conversation. And it was unbearable because I knew that time was running out, and soon all this deceit would come to light. But what could I do? How could I find a way out when inside, I was overwhelmed by feelings I could no longer control? It was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening. Nick was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, while I was in the kitchen, making dinner. My phone, as usual, lay on the table nearby. I didn't think much of it, since Nick rarely showed any interest in what I was doing. He was busy, always was. But that day, something went wrong. "Emily, you left your phone." I suddenly heard his voice from the living room. I froze in place. My palms instantly started sweating. Inside, everything stood still, as if time itself had stopped. In that very moment, I knew what he had found. My phone. The messages with Ethan. It was as though all my lies had surfaced like a long sunken ship. I didn't even know what to say. "What is this?" he asked, walking towards me and holding out the phone. There was pain in his voice, and that was even scarier than anger. His gaze? Nick had never looked at me like that before. I glanced at the screen and saw it. A simple message from Ethan. "When can we meet again?" These words, seemingly innocent at first glance, were charged with all the secrecy I had so carefully hidden. "Nick," I began, but the words got stuck in my throat. How could I explain all of this? How could I justify betrayal? "Have you been cheating on me, Emily?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, almost uncertain, as if he feared hearing the answer himself. I couldn't meet his eyes. I lowered my gaze and stayed silent. Each second of silence seemed to carve into our shared past, tearing it apart piece by piece. "You didn't answer," he continued, his voice firmer now, though the pain still lingered. "Tell me the truth." "Yes," I whispered, barely audible. I I have been." Those words, once spoken, filled the room with a heavy, unbearable silence. It felt as if the air had become thick, unmoving. Nick didn't move, didn't speak. I could see his face changing, how disappointment and pain gradually overwhelmed him. Is this... He paused, struggling to find the words. Was it Ethan? My brother? I nodded. There was nothing left to hide. Everything I had tried to keep together had crumbled. I could no longer lie. Every second of silence only confirmed the terrible truth. We need to talk, he said, his voice calm, but I could feel that inside he was falling apart. Let's go to the studio. The studio. The very place where it all began. I couldn't refuse. We drove in silence. Nick didn't ask any more questions, and I knew there was a battle raging inside him. His world had collapsed in just a few minutes, and I didn't know what to say to change that. When we arrived at the studio, Ethan was already there. Nick had obviously called him before showing me the phone. I saw Ethan. He was standing by the window, staring off into the distance. His face was tense. He probably suspected why he had been summoned. He heard us enter and turned around, his eyes immediately meeting mine. Ethan, Nick said, his voice too calm, too quiet. I think you have something to say. Ethan stayed silent. His eyes were full of pain, and in that moment, I saw that he too was broken. We were all broken. But it was most obvious in Nick. He stood in front of us, his back straight, but his eyes betrayed his state. I could see how shattered he was, how everything he had thought was his had collapsed in an instant. You both, he started again, and his voice carried a sharp edge of bitterness. How could you? Ethan took a step forward, but didn't come too close. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I stood between them, feeling how unbearably painful this moment was for all three of us. Nick, I finally said, but my words were meaningless. What could I say? How could I explain such a betrayal? No, Emily, he interrupted, his voice growing louder. You don't understand. You. He was barely keeping himself from shouting. You betrayed me with my brother. This isn't just infidelity. This is the worst thing I could have imagined. I couldn't look him in the eye. I couldn't face his pain. Everything inside me was tearing apart. I knew that words wouldn't change anything now. You were my family, he continued, his voice trembling. You were the people I trusted most. And now, what? What do I have left? Ethan was still silent. I could see he was trying to say something, but he couldn't. In that moment, all our lives changed. Everything we had was gone. I want to know one thing, Nick said, his gaze sharp and heavy. Why? Why did you do this? The silence hung in the air. I didn't know how to respond. How could I explain feelings I didn't understand myself? How could I explain that it wasn't planned, but it had become too strong to resist? I couldn't find the words to answer. There is no why, Nick, Ethan finally spoke, his voice hoarse. It wasn't right, and we both know that. But it happened. We didn't plan for this. Didn't plan for it? Nick bitterly laughed. What are you talking about? You slept with my wife, Ethan, my family. You don't even understand how this destroys everything. We stood in the studio, the three of us, surrounded by the works that had once symbolized my creativity, and now seemed like silent witnesses to our disaster. Every second of this meeting was unbearable. Every attempt to speak only deepened the wound. In that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. When I left Nick, there were no tears, no dramatic scenes. It was quiet and empty. Our marriage had been dead for a long time. We just hadn't been brave enough to admit it. I packed my things silently, placing them into the suitcase carefully, as if that could somehow bring order to the chaos inside me. Nick didn't try to stop me. He just watched as I gathered my life into a few bags. The silence was deafening. We both understood it was over. I saw it in his eyes. When I closed the door behind me, for a brief moment, it felt like something inside me snapped, as if it was the end of something important. But the loss wasn't as painful as I had expected. Perhaps because we had both long since stopped being to each other what we once were. But there was another realization. There could be no future with Ethan either. Everything that happened between us was an escape, an attempt to fill the emptiness I had carried within me for too long. Ethan was just as broken as I was. We were both searching in each other for something we couldn't find in ourselves. I thought that, with him, I could be different, more alive, more real. But in truth, it was all an illusion, and that realization came to me too late. I decided to leave, to move to another city where no one knew me, where I could start fresh. I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was modest, but it was a place where I could be alone. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation or had to meet anyone's expectations. It was my space, my silence, my path back to myself. The first few days were strange. I had to learn how to be alone, how to live alone. Looking back on my past, I realized how much time I had spent trying to please others. My life had always revolved around Nick, his needs, his successes, his ambitions. Even my relationship with Ethan, it was a reflection of my inability to face myself. I used it to escape the emptiness inside me. In this new city, there were no familiar faces, no reminders of what had happened. I started working at a small gallery, helping organize exhibitions. It wasn't as grand as my studio, but I liked it. Here, I was at a distance from all the complicated emotions that had haunted me in the past. Every day, I was learning to understand what I truly wanted from life. I began to realize that I had never lived for myself before. My life had always been built around the roles I played: the perfect wife, the successful artist, the one who always knew what to do. But beneath it all, I had lost myself a long time ago. It was as if I had been a spectator in my own life. One morning, I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't a major moment, not a turning point. I just realized that I no longer felt the heaviness inside. My heart was no longer weighed down by fear and guilt. I understood that I had found what I had been missing all along: the freedom to be myself. In the quiet of my new apartment, I began to reflect on what truly mattered to me. Not status, not success, not what others expected from me. I needed to figure out what it meant to live for myself. And I started finding the answers in simple things: walks through the streets of my new city, conversations with strangers in coffee shops, even in the silence when I sat alone by the window, watching life go by. I no longer felt the need to return to what once was. Nick and Ethan, they were part of my story, but not part of my future. I realized that our meeting was inevitable and what happened had to happen. But it also taught me a lesson I needed to learn. Until I could be whole, until I could understand myself, no relationship would ever fill the void inside me. In this new city, I had no grand plans. I was simply living, learning to appreciate the small moments, finding beauty in the little things. I started painting again, but now not for galleries or clients, but for myself. It was like returning to the roots of why I had started creating art in the first place. I realized it wasn't to prove something to anyone, but to express myself, my thoughts, my feelings. Life became a new page for me. I was no longer running from myself, no longer searching for someone to fill the emptiness. And while many questions and unknown paths still lay ahead of me, I was ready. Now I knew that my journey toward myself was only just beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. I learned how to be alone, and in that I found freedom.